Angie Smith found a stuffed animal that her daughters would appreciate, and she took it home to her family.
We sort of used that as an example that they would understand of what was happening, and we allowed the children to put Band-Aids on the bunny's heart.
Angie decided to use this stuffed animal to tell her little girls about a serious medical condition, something that was about to affect the entire family. This is the Revive Our Hearts podcast with Nancy DeMoss Wolgemuth, author of The Quiet Place. For May 24th, 2022, I'm Dana Gresh.
Recently, a woman named Kendall from Massachusetts contacted us to thank Revive Our Hearts for, as she put it, spreading truth and light.
One of the first episodes that I had ever listened to was actually a lady who lost her first 3 babies. One was a stillborn, one died at 7 months, and then she had a miscarriage at about 20 weeks or so. I remember that was the first one I listened to.
In that program, Evelyn Christensen, who's now with the Lord, recalled how she argued with God.
Now why are you doing this to me, Lord? Haven't I done enough? Haven't I given enough? Haven't I suffered enough?
Yes.
I think a lot of us ask that question.
Yes.
And he said, no, you're going to have to learn.
In God's providence, Kendall and her husband, Hogan, were about to face a similar pain. When Kendall was pregnant with their second child, an ultrasound revealed some serious problems.
She had what's called hypoplastic left heart syndrome.
That means Kendall and Hogan's baby only had half a heart.
The fatality rate is very high for that.
Little Emery lived almost 3 months in the NICU after she was born. Then the time came to say goodbye.
I remember them asking us if we were ready, and I couldn't speak. I remember just in my head thinking, like, no, how is anybody ever ready for this? And Hogan actually just kind of looked at the respiratory therapist and gave her a nod. And then she started taking out her tube, and all of her support was taken off. And I was just holding her, and the whole time she was alive, I always wanted to just hold her like up on my chest, but I couldn't because of her tube in her throat. But I was able to hold her like that, just to hold her. Her head was, where my heart is, and I was holding her, and Hogan was holding me. And I frequently say this, that in that moment we had 32 minutes of holding her before she passed away, but I felt Jesus' presence. I really felt like he was holding all 3 of us.
Emery's big sister, Ireland, was allowed to be there too, in spite of hospital COVID restrictions.
Even if I knew the final outcome, if I knew she was going to die in my arms, I would do it all again. I would do it again and again and again. It's just so worth it to be able to just have any amount of time with your children, no matter how short.
How sweet it was of the Lord to use the words of Evelyn Christensen that Kendall had heard on Revive Our Hearts to prepare her heart and to give her unexplainable hope in the midst of her grief and suffering.
God comforts us so that we can comfort those who are in like circumstances. And I believe with all my heart that that's the reason God chose to train and prepare me.
Well, Kendall kept listening to Revive Our Hearts. She now calls this her favorite podcast. She believes in what we're doing so much that she prays for this ministry and helps to support it with her giving. So thank you, Kendall and Hogan, for sharing Emery's story with us. And thank you, too, for sharing your prayers and your financial support. And let me just say thank you, too, to so many others who've prayed for this ministry and supported it so that it would be possible for us to minister comfort and grace to moms like Kendall as they're walking through difficult, painful circumstances. As we've been sharing with you over the last few weeks, this is a time of year when the support of friends like you is particularly helpful to Revive Our Hearts. So if the Lord prompts you to make a gift at this time, just know that you're helping to encourage women like Kendall all around the world. You can make a donation by visiting us at reviveourhearts.com or by calling us at 1-800-569-5959. Again, that number is 1-800-569-5959. You know, we hear from a lot of Revive Our Hearts listeners, like Kendall, who share with us the losses, sorrows, and griefs that they carry in different seasons of life. I think there's nothing like the pain of a parent losing a child. And I'm so grateful that we have with us in the studio this week my friend Angie Smith. Now, that name is probably familiar to many of our listeners. Angie is the wife of Todd Smith, who is the lead singer of the popular Christian group called Selah. I've heard them a number of times and have been really blessed by their ministry. And Angie is a blogger, she's an author, she's a conference speaker, she's a wife and mom, and she has a powerful testimony of God's grace in her life in a season of great loss. And we'll be hearing more about that over the next few days. And Angie, thank you so much for joining us here on Revive Our Hearts today and for being willing to open your heart and share with us your journey about walking through the loss of a child. I know that we have listeners today who are walking through that experience themselves, or perhaps they're facing some different kind of loss. And I really believe that your words and your story are going to be a great encouragement to many of our listeners.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
And I know, Angie, that from the time you were really young, you had a love for children. Did you just always want to be a mother?
I really did. I think I was that typical child who always had a little baby doll in a stroller pushing around. That sort of nurturing side of me came out early, and absolutely that was the longing that I had in my heart. I really felt like one day that was my ultimate calling, was to be a mother.
So when you and Todd got married, did you talk about wanting to have children?
We did. We hadn't really finished talking about it when I found out I was expecting, which is sometimes the way that the Lord works. And
in your first year of marriage, right?
Within a few months of being married, actually. And so it was a great surprise to both of us. And just about the time that we were able to settle in and be excited about it, we actually lost that child about 8 weeks into the pregnancy. So that was quite a blow early in our marriage.
And the Lord did bless you with a set of twin girls, but again, it wasn't an easy path to the delivery, was it?
It wasn't. I went into labor at about 25 weeks and had some amazing doctors around me and was put on bed rest in the hospital for about 10 weeks. And ended up having two beautiful, healthy baby girls.
Little girls.
Little. They were very small, 3'11" and 4'11", and just precious bright red hair.
Like yours?
Yes, and Todd's, which
Yeah.
is funny. We have a lot of red in both of our families. They were born at 35 weeks, and really Abby had to stay in the NICU for a few weeks because of her weight. But other than that, they were just perfectly healthy and such blessings right from the start.
And then the Lord gave you another child.
Yes.
Who did not have red hair.
No. But
And was different in a lot of respects.
She was. I like to call her my humbler. She came into the world with an entirely different viewpoint of how she was going to take it on. And Abby and Ellie are more hesitant when they come into a situation. They sort of want to sit back and assess and then become a part of it. So
And Kate takes over.
She takes it over.
With big, beautiful, dark eyes.
She does, that are very hard to say no to. But I always say to myself at the end of the day, if I can not pull out all of my hair and I can make it through this time period, she is going to be a warrior for the Lord, because she just, everything she does, it's 150%. So.
And so you got pregnant again.
Yes.
And excited about that?
Very excited about that. And I must say, with the excitement, though, even from the very beginning, I just didn't feel the same peace that I had with my other pregnancies.
And when did you first know that something was different with this one?
Well, the first time we had an indication, they had done some testing, which came back slightly abnormal. But for this particular test, it isn't uncommon to be abnormal. So our doctor really wasn't very concerned and told us not to be concerned. And at that point, sort of the worst case scenario was that the baby would have Down syndrome. And in my work doing developmental psychology research and working with children, I've done a lot of work with children who have Down syndrome. And certainly would want to know beforehand so that I could prepare and prepare my children, but it wasn't something that we were really alarmed about the possibility of. So we went into an 18-week ultrasound in order for them to evaluate whether or not they thought this child had Down syndrome. And unfortunately for us, that wasn't the case.
So you were with Todd having this ultrasound.
Yes.
And what was your first indication that something was not right.
It was very quick. The technician just started the ultrasound, and within what felt like a matter of seconds, her face just changed. And I always say the air in the room just sort of shifted. It was that feeling of, I can tell that nothing is going to be the same after this. There's something going on that's going to change our lives. I do remember asking her if she thought the baby would survive, and she just sort of stuttered around and said, I don't know. There are a number of problems that I'm going to need to bring the doctor in to explain to you.
And did the doctor come in at that point?
He did. He came in. Todd's mother was actually supposed to fly back home to Detroit, and she also was unsettled and ended up staying in Nashville with us to come to this appointment with us, just to be in the waiting room, to be praying, to be there, which in retrospect is pretty amazing. Yeah. It was a gift. So Todd had gone out to get his mother to tell her what was going on. And in the meantime, the doctor came in to the room, and the doctor said, "How are you feeling, honey? How are you dealing with this?" And I said, "My Jesus is the same now as he was before I walked in that door." And I just kept repeating it, and I kept clinging to it, and I needed to hear it. That was the stable ground in this bedrock. Chaos. Absolutely.
What did the doctor say to you?
He's not a believer. So he nodded, and I think he was relieved for my sake that I had something that I could cling to. But at the same time, he had seen the report that had come back to him, and he knew that he was about to deliver some really hard news to me.
Which was?
Audrey had at least 3 complications that they deemed incompatible with life. Among those were the fact that her kidneys hadn't developed properly. There was an extreme lack of amniotic fluid, and her heart was about 4 times the size it should be. It took up about 80% of her chest, which is alarming in and of itself, but more than that was indicative that her lungs were not developing the way that they needed to. And in that ultrasound, there were several other, I would say, more minor issues that they came across, but at some point they sort of even stopped looking. I mean, they said, "We've seen enough to tell you that there isn't any point in carrying this pregnancy."
So they said there was no way that she could live, and therefore you should terminate the pregnancy at that point?
Yes. From a scientific, from a medical standpoint, there just wasn't any hope of this turning into something that would be life-sustaining. So they actually scheduled a termination for the next day.
And you and Todd looked at each other and up to the Lord.
Yes.
And what did you do?
We were just in shock. I mean, I think it was one of those times where I really feel like I was having an internal dialogue with the Lord, and everything that was happening was sort of moving around me, but I wasn't really able to be part of that conversation yet because I was just trying to come to terms with what was happening in my own mind. And so we did a lot of nodding and a lot of listening and a lot of just, Todd and I both had the sense, and we've talked about this since then, of just needing to get through it and get out of there. I mean, it was just one of those things where we felt so overwhelmed. We just needed some space to be alone and be with the Lord and seek his counsel and not the counsel of those we were with. But we did allow them to schedule what they put on the books as a termination only because a doctor we really wanted to see, who had been instrumental in helping our twin daughter survive, was going to be visiting the hospital the next morning. And as long as I was checked in, he would come and see me on his rounds. And we were hoping that he would give a second opinion. And of course, we were praying that he wouldn't find the same thing that the other doctors had.
So you came back, checked into the hospital.
We did. Spent the night at the hospital that night so that we would be there first thing in the morning when he made his rounds. And he came through and he recognized me and remembered everything that I had been through and just sweetly said, "I really hoped I would never have to see you again," because he is a doctor who only deals with situations where there's a life-threatening problem with the baby.
And he looked at the report.
He did, and in fact, he did another ultrasound and found essentially the same thing that the other doctor had and confirmed that the diagnosis was accurate.
And did he have the same recommendation to terminate the pregnancy?
His words exactly were, "My recommendation is that you not terminate the pregnancy, not because of my stance on the issue, but because I know what your stance is." He's the same doctor who I found out later with my twins The night that I came into the hospital, the nurses had sort of taken bets on whether or not they thought I was going to make it because it looked pretty bleak when I first checked in. And he's not a believer. But when I delivered my twins, he came in afterwards and he said to me, I just want you to know your God has performed a miracle with these babies. So there was a recognition of my faith, and we had the opportunity to have many faith-based conversations in that time. And he knew that that wouldn't be an option for Todd.
Even though you had some pretty close people, in addition to the medical personnel, who thought there was some valid reasons to terminate that pregnancy.
Yes, and I really empathize in a different way to something that is, to me, a very black and white issue. Because in our situation, there was an indication that Audrey might be in pain, progressively worse as the pregnancy continued. So there was a sense for myself and for Todd of, what would the Lord want? What is more humane in this situation? Would it be, how do we parent her best? And we did grapple with that, but it became very obvious to us that God had a plan for her life that we didn't have the right to have a say on at that point in time. So we decided to carry her, and I'm so grateful that we did.
And that's the name of your book, I Will Carry You, which you chose to do by God's grace.
Yes.
And yet those next 14 weeks that you carried Audrey Caroline were anything but easy.
It was a very difficult time for us. And of course, we had 3 small children at home. So there was always the balance of, we want our children to have a hope in the Lord that surpasses any medical diagnosis, and we want to live in that hope. And at the same time, we need them to be aware of what we think may happen based on what we've seen. And that was a very delicate line that we walked for those months.
So your twins were 5, and Kate was?
Probably 3 during this.
What did you say to your children?
Well, I knew with my background that it needed to be concrete. Pregnancy is, it's such an abstract concept. It's hard for us to even comprehend what the Lord is doing in the womb, let alone trying to explain it to, toddlers and preschoolers. And so we found a stuffed animal that had a mark on its heart. I talk about that in the book, and we sort of used that as an example that they would understand of what was happening, and we allowed the children to put Band-Aids on the bunny's heart, and the bunny came with us everywhere we went, and we really just tried to make her a part of our life. Really, every day that we did things and places we went and the things we did, they were, my kids had disposable cameras they'd bring with us everywhere and take pictures of my tummy to say Audrey was at the ballet or Audrey was at the park, or she was just really very much a part of our everyday lives.
And you decided you were going to live life including Audrey during those weeks. What did some of that look like?
Well, my daughter Ellie decided that she wanted to show Audrey Cinderella's castle. So a few weeks after the diagnosis, we ended up taking a trip, which was intended to be just our family, and then turned into sort of a big family adventure with our parents and some close friends. And we did get to go and see the castle, and we have pictures. So we just had experiences like that, and we would talk to her during the day, and she was just really she was already their sister.
And during that time, you began to journal some of what you were going through, initially just to keep friends and family updated on the journey. I imagine there were a lot of questions you were having to answer. And that journal became a blog called Bring the Rain that ended up attracting thousands and thousands of followers who didn't know you personally but were following that story. And you quote from some of those journal entries, some of those blog posts in your book. And here's one I've opened to that you wrote just shortly after that trip to Disney. And let me read what you wrote, and then just let me ask you to comment on it. You said, I believe that in one way or another, God will answer our prayer to heal Audrey. It may not be here the way we wish it could be, but I have complete faith that she will be whole, and it won't be temporary. If you only hear me say this one thing, all of these words will be worth it. For all of you who want to know the great secret to how we are breathing through this, it is pretty simple. It is pretty simple. He is enough. I'm not a preacher. I will not pretend to be. I'm a woman who realizes more and more every day that I want Jesus more than I want the teacups to keep spinning. In this life, we are going to be disappointed. We will hurt, but there is great joy in the shadows if you know where to look.
As a woman who became a believer as an adult, I hadn't yet had a storm like this in my life. And I remember the emotion of that moment and sort of having the opportunity to put my full weight into Jesus for the first time as a believer. And this overwhelming peace that came with that, I just hadn't understood it up until that point. And as much as in a human sense, I would change things because I love my daughter and I want to hold her and I want to raise her, I have loved Jesus in a different way since that moment, because I did the thing I had never done before, which is to say, you're all or nothing. And either this is going to be something amazing or I'm going to be really let down. And so to me, that time and the way that it shaped my faith and my boldness in speaking of him, I wouldn't trade that for the world. And I feel like that was really echoed in some of my writings from that time, that even in the midst of the darkness, I wanted people who didn't believe to see a woman who was, humanly speaking, in an impossible situation saying, this is not impossible, and he is enough.
And you had to find him to be enough, not only carrying this little girl that you knew, humanly speaking, was not going to live, but also just going through life. You talk about being at a friend's baby shower.
Yes. That was a very difficult time. It was just a few days after my diagnosis. She was a dear friend. I didn't want to miss it. But at the end of the shower, of course, we all gathered around to pray for her and to pray for the baby. She was also expecting a girl. And our heads were bowed, and as women went around the room praying for the health of the child and for safe delivery and for my friend's health, you could just hear sobs start around the room because, of course, all of those women knew that that was not the situation that I was in, and they wanted to be sensitive to it. And I remember hugging my friend as I left and just feeling our stomachs pressed up against each other and thinking what different plans the Lord had for each of our children.
And in the midst of that, you had the privilege of choosing to trust the Lord's heart when you couldn't see or understand the script he was writing.
Mm-hmm.
And you kept lifting your eyes up, even when they were filled with tears.
Yes.
And turning your heart to the Lord. And I'm so thankful that throughout your book, you've included a lot of scriptures that were particularly meaningful to you during this whole season, not erasing the pain, not making the journey easy, but tethering your heart, counseling your heart with what was true, rather than letting fears, apprehensions, emotions drive your life. Those fears were there, the apprehensions were there, the emotions were there, but deeper than all of that was truth. God. He is enough. And one of the passages you quoted is one that's familiar, but I think it probably became even more meaningful to you during that time, found in Isaiah 43. And I just want to read these verses because as they washed your heart during that season, I think there's some listeners today who are perhaps facing similar or very different circumstances, whose hearts need to be washed with these same words. Listen as I read from Isaiah 43. But now, thus says the Lord, He who created you, O Jacob, He who formed you, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. And when I read that, I think not only of Israel and Jacob, but I think of you, Angie, during this season, and I think of Audrey, Caroline, who you were carrying in your womb. God says, I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned. Doesn't say you won't walk through fire.
Right.
But it says the flame shall not consume you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. And you found those words to be really, really true.
I did. And as difficult as it is to think back on that time, there's a sweetness that came in my quiet times and in my walk with the Lord, where exactly what you said, many of these scriptures, we've heard them so many times that we sort of take the depth of them for granted. And there were certain scriptures that I came across that I feel like I had read, a couple hundred times before that. And I read them with completely different eyes when I was walking through this. We hear people talk about the peace that passes all understanding, and that's a common phrase. My husband tells the story of Horatio Spafford, the man who penned the song "It Is Well With My Soul." And the background to that story is that he had lost 4 daughters in a ship accident. And as he was passing over the waters where their bodies were, he was pacing the deck and saying, "It is well with my soul, it is well." And then he wrote the rest of that song shortly after. And I feel like I had taken a lot of scripture for granted and memorized it and knew the words, but I don't feel like I had fully taken it in and claimed the strength in it until this time. And so looking back, and scriptures like the one that you just read, Nancy, those are really, we can't brush over those lightly. He's called us by name. He knows our names. He knew my daughter's name. There's just such significance in spending time meditating on that simple fact that I think I've glossed over for many years.
When we come back on Revive Our Hearts tomorrow, we want to hear the rest of the story. And although it's a story that's still being written in Angie's heart and in her family, the book where she tells the entire story is called "I Will Carry You." It's by Angie Smith. And I know that many of our listeners will want to get a copy of that book and perhaps get one to share with someone else that you know who's going through a season of loss or grief. And I think it will really minister grace to many in that season of life. Thank you, Angie, for joining us, and we're going to pick up the story when we continue next on Revive Our Hearts.
It is well with my soul, it is well with my soul.
Angie Smith's book is "I Will Carry You, The Sacred Dance of Grief and Joy." There's information on how you can order it in the transcript of this program at reviveourhearts.com. I want to remind you that Revive Our Hearts is listener-supported. That means we depend on your prayers and your donations to continue bringing you content on a daily basis, month after month, year after year. Would you be a part of what God's doing? Head on over to reviveourhearts.com to see how much progress we've made toward our May goal of $775,000. And consider how the Lord might have you play a part. We'd love to hear from you this week. Our phone number is 1-800-569-5959. Again, it's 1-800-569-5959. And thank you. Well, Todd and Angie Smith only had a couple of hours with their newborn daughter before her time on this earth was over. Surprisingly, they described those 2 hours as peaceful. Find out how these parents could find peace while watching their daughter's life end tomorrow on Revive Our Hearts. Revive Our Hearts with Nancy DeMoss Walgemuth, helping you find freedom, fullness, fruitfulness, and comfort in Christ.